but I do want to take this opportunity to introduce our next speaker, who is Jacob Peterson. As Forest Restoration Officer for the EMNRD Forestry Division, Jacob supports operational performance and forest and watershed health goals statewide through contract and grant management, training, planning, and outreach. Jacob also staffs the New Mexico 30 by 30 initiative, manages the Forest Stewardship Program, and supports implementation of the Forest and Watershed Restoration Act. So turn your eyes over here. I'm going to hand this off to him for our next talk.
Thank you.
I'll keep time.
Is there a clicker?
Yes, right here.
Are these slides or the PDF?
They're slides.
Okay. Looks good. Right. Thank you. I apologize for the first slide. I gave this presentation a couple weeks ago to the New Mexico Northern Wetlands Roundtable, and it was online. And this slideshow is designed to be given online, but sitting out there, I don't know how visible it is for those who are here in person. But I don't think it matters. I'm going to try to make it a little bit more conversational because I don't know if you just want to listen to me talk about an executive order for a half hour. Anyway, I'm here to talk about New Mexico 30 by 30. And I found out I was giving the presentation yesterday. My boss, State Forester Laura McCarthy, was supposed to be here and apologizes she cannot be here. She's quite busy with the fires going on in the state, but I will do my best to fill in. So the committee is formed through an executive order, and this is a list of the committees, the executive agencies that are on the committee, in addition to the administrative, like the executive agencies under the governor. The state land office is also invited to participate, and this is those who are participating on the committee. The executive order 2021-052, this won't take a half hour. It directs the agencies on the last slide to meet quarterly to discuss, to coordinate existing programs and authorities. There's no new funding. There's no new staff created. As Eugene said earlier, this is the other duties as assigned, I think, for me and Laura. Okay, so this is on top of it all, but it's, you know, it's a really fun thing to do. So, you know, it's defining certain values that conserved lands and waters in New Mexico provide us. Supporting the economy, sustaining traditional ways of life, providing drinking water, ensuring food security, preserving biodiversity, and providing recreation opportunities. So as I said, we're an advisory group, so I'm staffing this group. The committee is an advisory group, and you know that word means that it's not an open public meeting. And the goal is to get them to coordinate existing programs and authorities toward these goals of 30% of New Mexico conserved by 2030 and 20% additional percentage of the state designated as climate stabilization areas. The values and some more guidelines for that are use of best available science, commitment to equity, robust stakeholder engagement, timely recommendations on state and federal policies, and ensuring that the state's efforts are accurately reflected in the American Conservation and Stewardship Atlas. Other values that guide the work, and these are core principles that emerge from the first couple meetings. There have only been 2 meetings of the committee so far. I'll give you a summary of what happened. Committee 1, okay, we're a committee. What are we here to do? Meeting number 2, wow, this is going to be really difficult. But we did come up with some good core policies. Respect for tribal sovereignty is the first. And I want to go back really quick. So this one, this means, we're not expecting tribes and pueblos to respect any definition of conservation, what conserved lands are. We're not going to make any attempts to say, hey, we've determined which lands within your sovereign lands are conserved or not. We're leaving it up to them to decide how they want to participate in these goals. You go forward one. Thanks. 2, respect for private property rights. There's a lot of stuff in the news about 30 by 30, and it's not just because of the state executive order, it's because of the federal America the Beautiful initiative. There's another, I know the New Mexico Association of Counties, for example, has come out with their own policy document. I'm actually sorry, I misspoke. It was the National Association of Counties. And there's like a Western Caucus that come out with their own policy document. And it really is the energy behind both Biden's America the Beautiful initiative and the state initiative that's kind of parallel to that, is ending up and having the effect of focusing us people on what is the definition of conservation? Like, how do we map it? What counts? What doesn't count? It kind of, just becomes an accounting exercise. And we don't want, and one thing this value is meant to represent that, and there's a lot of fear that it will result in additional restrictions being placed on private property as a result, of calling it conserved lands. We're going to call it's counting toward 30 by 30. Therefore, there's some magical restriction being placed on private property. That's just not true. There's no authority under any of the divisions, departments that are participating in the committee. There's no new existing magical authority for taking a private property or police powers or anything like that. And there's no intention to do so. 3, maintaining adaptability in a changing climate. And this is meant to represent that active management of land is a reality and actually a necessity. I mean, I can say in forestry, we do thinning projects for forest health projects, right? And there's, natural working lands, active ranching, regenerative agriculture. Those are active things that need to be, any practice that results in a benefit on the landscape or to the values that we mentioned earlier. That's kind of the point of conservation, right? As those improvements. And so this is, adaptability means not restricting ourselves on what that means. And 4th is a role for natural and working lands. And this is, we really think about natural and working lands when we're thinking about this 20% climate stabilization area. What does that mean? Background on America the Beautiful. It's a Biden initiative. It's also a 30 by 30 kind of goal. The key part there is they're coming out with this American Conservation and Stewardship Atlas, where they'll be mapping conservation activities across the whole country. And there is and part of the reason that the state initiative, I think, is happening is to like make sure that the state's perspective on how New Mexico conservation should be reflected accurately in that national tool. And there are 8 core principles to America the Beautiful. I won't go over them, but they are they're very similar to the ones I went over earlier. Some focus areas, America the Beautiful, create more parks, support tribally led conservation and restoration priorities, expand collaborative conservation of fish and wildlife habitats, increase access for outdoor recreation, incentives to reward voluntary conservation efforts, and creating jobs by investing in restoration and resilience. So defining conservation. again, the EO really, the core part of this is setting the goal of having at least 30% of lands in New Mexico conserved by 2030 and identifying an additional 20% designated as climate stabilization areas. And this is around the time I'm going to start talking less and asking for more feedback from you all. But what do these terms mean? I think that one thing I can say that's come out of the first two meetings is that this whole year, 2022, is going to be about listening. Really, the committee's requirements is to write a report at the end of the year and talk about how are we going to achieve these goals? Where are we at now? In order to do that, in order to be able to say what, how far along are we? What counts and doesn't count? We want to spend this year listening, and we started last month with 3 tribal listening sessions, which were just committee members and tribes and pueblos were invited to attend, just to kind of see, pretty much this presentation, but also just to have a conversation about, how things are, how they would like to be involved, and to be more, have a chance for committee members to listen to representatives on how they would like to be included and participate in the initiative. So here's just an overview of existing. This is just meant to kind of give the first overview of the state. There's 3 categories here. There's some things we can all agree are conservation or conserved lands. Wilderness areas are probably a classic. National parks, monuments, conservation easements, legal tools used to restrict some uses for the benefit of biodiversity, watershed health, and those sorts of things. But then there's kind of a gray area. So, a little more gray would be roadless areas on national forest lands. And then we end up in areas, if you look at the big blue areas at the bottom, private lands, a lot of those private lands are natural and working lands. The other BLM land category is the second biggest category here, just over 10 million acres, I think 12 million acres, where, those are lands, majority of them have leasing, grazing leases on them. State Land Office, which Bianca spoke about earlier, and then 5 million acres of sovereign lands. So, when we look at these, we're not really making any, we're just trying to, we're trying to say, some things we can agree on and some things we can't, but where's the line? And how do we want, what we want to talk about this year is, and listen to folks on, is what should count? What are you doing that you feel like deserves to be recognized for the conservation value of those land management practices? And how can we track those things and account for them without creating some, multi-million-dollar consulting mapping project that confuses people? So how do we keep it simple, but how do we make it, reflect the good work that's happening outside of the obvious protected conserved landscapes? And this is just a couple slides we have about existing definitions of conservation. But I think, the one here is the climate stabilization areas has been used, and is a relatively recent term to describe relatively intact and semi-intact lands that store a relatively large amount of carbon. And one thing actually we are doing, my colleague Jeremy Klass is working on a grant with the US Climate Alliance to use carbon flux tower data from Marcy Litvak's lab at UNM and FIA data to fund training NASA, a model with a university researcher at University of Maryland, to take NASA data and come out with a way to get baseline information about carbon storage, terrestrial forest carbon storage across the whole state. I think going back to 2005. And so that's one way to figure out where carbon's at, but that's just data, right? How do we define that in the complex socio environmental context of the entire state. So next steps for the initiative is robust public engagement. We are developing plans now, and I think that you can expect there's some kind of request for information that's just kind of a general feedback on 30 by 30 conceptually. It would be a web online form that would be filled out. At some point after the first, after public engagement really starts, releasing draft definitions of conservation and climate stabilization areas and giving some indication of how they would be applied, like what would count, what wouldn't count, what, under, and then getting feedback and having additional workshops and conversations about, well, this, what should count and what should not count. And then the third step is to review existing programs, and this is the existing programs and authorities part of the executive order, to give some indication of what is in our current toolbox to achieve the 30 by 30 goals. And then, the next part would be, it's a gap analysis. So what's missing? Can we get there with what we currently have in our toolkit? Or do we need to make investments elsewhere at the policy level or whatever it might be? And that those ideas too, we're interested in hearing about, because, if there's one thing we have the opportunity to do on the committee has the opportunity to, listen this year and try to look for ideas that could potentially, we could say yes to. And then in December, there will be an annual report to the governor, which is required under the order. And then we have existing programs here. I mean, the State Land Office, we discussed it earlier. There's the land use restriction codes, conservation leasing ideas. We have, in Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources Department, we have some tools which may or may not be funded. They're not traditional conservation programs, except for the Natural Heritage Conservation Act, which is, but it's an unfunded program. The Department of Agriculture Healthy Soils Program. And so we have programs that either are explicitly, result in some enhancement to lands, which might contribute to 30 by 30 goals. And the timeline here is I think I'll just leave this one up, and then I want to transition and just ask the group here, and it's been lovely to meet many of you today, but where we're at now is really looking for ideas about what public engagement opportunities, particularly for natural working lands, might the committee take advantage of this year, to host workshops, get deeper into conversations, potentially present draft definitions and talk about them. It's one of those things where I can say we all want to do a great job on it, and I think that it is unfunded, but 30 by 30, I think in the best case scenario, is an opportunity to have a conversation about what conservation means to New Mexico, and to maybe pivot away from some of the older concerns where conservation is a political idea that's used as a for leverage, but it would be better, I think, if we define conservation in such a way that it should be a benefit, not a burden for landowners. And many of the programs out there that provide conservation benefit are not conservation easement or legal restrictions on lands. It's if there's a program out there that provides benefit to the landowner and a conservation benefit on top of that, and that program and adoption of that program is going up and to the right, well, I don't care if who cares if some lands within that graph, within that curve are going out of it every now and again. It might make sense for that landowner. They might have other needs, other concerns in their life to think about, but how can the set of our conservation programs out there grow and thrive so that there's more area of adoption of those practices under the curve? I think if there's an opportunity this year beyond just doing this accounting exercise and writing a report, I think it's maybe coming up with some of those latent policy ideas or program ideas that we could consider in the future. So. And I'm tired, so I need help facilitating. I see some hands raised. Okay, 5 minutes. Let's take one.
Great. Thank you so much.
I'm sorry. Okay, Jacob, Western Landowners Alliance went before the American Beautiful came out program. They spent a lot of time and effort to get the Biden administration to adopt locally led parts of that a lot of the conversations should be locally led in the different areas. And when the governors came out with her 30 by 30 plan, that part was left out, and about locally led, and the way it's done, it's like from the top down. And we've gotten a lot of pushback, especially like just Rio Arriba County, their county just adopted a resolution saying no 30 by 30, and so has some of the other organizations like Cattle Growers, I think, and Farm Bureau and some of those other organizations. So is there a way to bring it back to, from the, to have that locally led thing, I think, without that, I think you're going to continue to get that pushback from some of these organizations.
It's a great question. When I see that, I try not to think too much about the resolutions being passed, and it's not because they're not significant or important. It's just that we can only run this outreach process this year the best we can, and those resolutions don't tie the hands of landowners in how they participate. And we want to, I think that I can tell you the committee wants to have good faith, interaction and engagement with local people about what they think, how they see conservation in their county or in their town or wherever it might be, and how it can be a benefit, and to make sure that their views are considered as the committee makes recommendations to the governor about how to proceed with 30 by 30, which is its role. So I think that some people, of course, are going to go and use it as a, it's a political thing. And you can certainly see it that way, and you wouldn't be wrong, but it doesn't have to only be a political thing. It can also be a substantial thing that results in some conversations and ideas and hopefully progress in different areas in the future. So I thought, let people participate on their own, with their own deciding for themselves, and regardless of if they want to come, they can come.
Thanks. Have we got any other questions? Yes. Are you sure? No, I'm going to run this to you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I appreciated how you approached the subject of indigenous sovereignty, and I wanted to ask you, how do you begin the conversation with a tribe, or to be able to communicate that what lands are going to be determined by them to be conserved or to be a part of the 30 by 30 project?
I can tell you the way that the listening sessions were conducted, and it wasn't me. This is me supporting it, and I was more helping people make sure they got the invitations. Okay, so this is not coming from me directly, but it was presenting, here's what the executive order does, here's what we have to do. We recognize there's 5 million acres of sovereign lands in the state, and you get to decide how you participate, and we want you to, but we don't want to tell you how that what that looks like. We want to maybe listen to you before we work through those details. And that's where it is now. That's where the conversation is now. And the only thing I'd add is, I wish that we had a team working on it and we had more money to fund one, because there are a whole lot of tribes and pueblos in New Mexico, and that's a whole lot of acres. And that's a lot of, and we've had participation in the listening sessions, but it's by no means comprehensive. And at some point, the committee has to decide to move forward. And there's a certain amount of capacity to continue those conversations. We're working closely with the Indian Affairs Department on it. They've been great, and letting us know, and when there's an opportunity to present to a group that's meeting, and that's another area where if there's ideas for how those conversations can move forward effectively, I'll take them back with me.
Yeah. Great. Thank you. Good answer. Have you tried approaching the TIPO office, the Tribal Protection Office, and sort of the Office of Cultural Affairs, identifying that cultural sites could be a part of it to be protected?
Yes, they're on our list, and they're one of the programs up here on the slide. So, and that is, there's interest there too. There's interest in even lands outside of sovereign boundaries of cultural properties that there's an opportunity to highlight, hey, here are our priorities outside of our sovereign lands for lands that should be under conservation for historic preservation, cultural preservation reasons. Yep.
Thank you.
Sarah?
Just sort of reflecting on Lawrence's question, I'm curious if you all have sort of surveyed other entities that have developed statements, ideas, or policies that are sort of relating to the 30 by 30 concept, just to sort of understand where there are places where you can plug in because people are having the conversation, or where there's going to be resistance. Because it seems like, whether it's formal or not, there may be local entities of a variety of different flavors that, or affinity groups that may have some ideas that they're already sort of working on. Have you thought about that at all?
I think that Laura would have a much better answer than me to this great question, but I think thinking about it, yes, but in the abstract sense, where we'd like to connect with them this year, and I think that, but I can say that creating the venue to do that on top of, it's just like, we're looking for opportunities of existing, venues for that type of collaboration and connection where we can plug in. So we're not actually hosting the events or trying to stand it up because we don't have the staff to really do that. But but we are giving a lot of these presentations online and group to group. So it's not just, it's going to be some online opportunities for online, just form-based engagement surveys, but also we tend to say yes when there's a request to have a direct conversation with groups. So, and the participants there tend to be MNRD Secretary Probst and Cottrell Probst and or McCarthy. So, and if it's a specific, issue that might, MNRD is staffing it, but there are staff in other departments as well. IAD has staff who are supporting it. Game and Fish, State Land Office, Will Barnes is participating. So NMDA, Max Henkels, and Julie Maitland and Jeff Whitty are all participating a lot in this. So we can, if you tell us who would want to talk to us about it, then we can always create that opportunity and make sure we're connecting the right people on the committee to that.
More questions?
Let's see what happens. Yeah, come to me. Thank you.
I had a question just in regards to the land that's, I guess, within your, that's more accessible in terms of creating these sort of spaces. Does that include waterways? Does that make sense? Or is that a part of the conversation? Or, I mean, when we talk about lands and putting aside 30, percent, does that include water spaces as well?
Yeah, I think indirectly, yes, because we're not, and I want to emphasize, this is not about putting aside land so that nothing can ever happen to it and every leaf will grow exactly where it needs to grow. It's more, where are we now as a baseline? What is already conserved? Working on how does that relate to where carbon is and other resource values are on the landscape? And where are the gaps in our existing programs to do better at conserving those important resources that don't yet have some form of institutional protection? So it doesn't have to be an easement or wilderness, but if there's a durable, socio-cultural use of that kind of protects, de facto protects that land, then that is something to consider. The Environment Department, the River Stewardship Program is on our list and participating. And a lot of those waterways are also recreational. And Axie Navis is also on the committee and participating. So I think, people are participating on the committee. It seems like a bad answer. However, I think that it's generally true that when we look at lands that deserve protection, the waters are those sacred lands that end up coming to the top of the list. Yeah. But any protection for those lands in terms of the committee needs to happen under existing programs and authorities. Just want to really emphasize that, none of which are like, okay, this is important. Now the committee is going to, make a decision to put it aside. And none of those shenanigans are happening. It's all about existing programs and then the gap analysis. What are we missing as far as lands that deserve protection? Do we have the tools to pursue that?